Alex and Sophie had been looking forward to this vacation for months. After a hectic year filled with work stress, personal challenges, and barely any time to relax, they craved an escape, a chance to unwind in the peaceful solitude of nature. The secluded resort they chose was nestled deep in the heart of an ancient forest, far removed from the hustle and bustle of city life. The website promised luxury accommodations, breathtaking views, and complete tranquility. When they arrived, the first thing that struck them was the silence. It was almost unnerving how quiet the place was. They checked in at the front desk where an older woman greeted them with a warm, welcoming smile. She was the only staff member they saw during their arrival, though the resort had dozens of rooms. The couple was led to their apartment, a modern, spacious unit with high ceilings, large windows overlooking dense woods, and a clean, fresh scent in the air. Everything about the apartment screamed comfort and relaxation. A king-sized bed, a cozy sitting area with plush chairs and a well-equipped kitchen made the place seem perfect for their retreat. Despite the idyllic surroundings, there was something about the resort that felt slightly off. The forest was eerily still, and though they could hear the occasional chirp of birds, there were no other sounds. No rustling leaves, no distant footsteps, no laughter from other guests. It was almost as if the entire place was suspended in time. As they explored their apartment, Alex noticed a small wooden door at the end of the hallway. It looked old, out of place with the rest of the apartment's modern decor. Sophie, intrigued, walked toward it but was interrupted by Alex calling her to join him by the window. They shrugged it off, assuming the door was some kind of forgotten storage closet. As evening descended and the daylight slowly faded, they settled into the apartment, preparing to enjoy a quiet evening together. They opened a bottle of wine, sat on the couch, and chatted about the events of the past few months. The mood was light, and the beautiful scenery outside was almost therapeutic. The couple had everything they could have hoped for: peace, relaxation, and each other's company. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., their peaceful retreat was shattered. The sound, faint at first, began to creep into their awareness. At first they assumed it was just the wind rustling through the trees outside. But then the sound became unmistakable, the soft, consistent cry of a baby. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She sat up wide-eyed and looked at Alex, who was also awake now, listening intently. The cry wasn't distant, nor was it muffled by the walls. It was coming from somewhere close. The unsettling thing was that it was almost rhythmic, almost like a broken lullaby. Confused and concerned, they stayed silent, each waiting for the other to speak first. Was it from another guest's room? Had they arrived at the resort at a time when another family's baby was unsettled? Sophie felt uneasy, like the sound was closing in on them. The cry became more pronounced, more persistent, until Sophie could no longer bear it. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to Alex, her voice trembling. He nodded, trying to remain calm, but the sound was inescapable. The wail echoed off the walls of their apartment, and it seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Alex finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "It must be from the next room. Maybe we should go check." They got out of bed, both feeling a strange unease creeping up their spines. As they made their way to the hallway, the cry continued. Now, accompanied by the faintest hint of desperation, Sophie felt her breath catch in her chest. They reached the door to the neighboring apartment, unsure of how to handle the situation. Should they knock and ask if everything was all right, or would it be intrusive? They decided to proceed, and with shaky hands, Alex knocked on the door. When the door opened, they were met with the gaze of a woman who appeared to be in her late 30s. She looked weary, with pale skin and dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was slightly unkempt, and her expression was blank, almost vacant. She didn't seem startled by their visit, rather she looked almost as if she were expecting them. Her clothes were simple, worn out but clean, and there was a strange calmness to her demeanor that only made the situation more unsettling. Sophie hesitated before speaking, trying to keep her voice steady. We're staying in the apartment, across the hall, and we keep hearing a baby crying. "Is everything all right?" she asked, the words sounding awkward and out of place in the strange atmosphere of the moment. The woman nodded slowly, her gaze shifting downward. "Oh yes, my baby. He cries like that sometimes. It's normal," she said almost mechanically. Her tone was flat, lacking the distress one would expect from a mother dealing with a child who couldn't sleep. The woman's eyes didn't meet theirs. Instead, they seemed to be looking at something far off, as if she were lost in a different world. It was as if the idea of a crying baby had become so familiar to her that it no longer seemed unusual or alarming. Sophie and Alex exchanged a glance, feeling even more confused and unsettled. The woman's nonchalant response didn't match the intensity of the cries they had been hearing. And there was something about her, something off about her presence. She didn't seem concerned about the noise at all, as if she had grown so accustomed to it that it no longer fazed her. The woman's voice cut through their thoughts. "It's nothing to worry about," she said, her tone suddenly sharper, more insistent, as though she was trying to reassure them. "He's just restless. It's nothing new." Before either of them could respond, the woman closed the door with a soft, almost apologetic click, as if the conversation was over. They were left standing there in silence, the lingering sense of unease growing stronger. Both Alex and Sophie stood motionless for a moment, unsure what to make of the encounter. They turned and walked back to their apartment, the baby's cries still echoing through the halls, louder than before. Neither of them spoke as they re-entered their room, each unsure of how to process what had just happened. Was it just a mother trying to comfort her child? Or was something far more sinister at play? The unanswered questions gnawed at them, but neither was brave enough to confront it further. But as soon as the door shut behind them, the cries resumed, louder than ever. And this time, something was different. Along with the baby's wail came a disturbing sound, an eerie, mocking laughter. It echoed throughout the apartment, an unnatural, haunting sound that sent shivers down their spines. Sophie froze, her blood running cold as she glanced at Alex. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The laughter wasn't normal, and it was accompanied by something else, a sense of dread, an ominous presence that seemed to fill the room. The air grew thick, and the cries mixed with the laughter in a cacophony that made it impossible to focus on anything else. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in on them. Neither of them could make sense of it, but they both knew something wasn't right. Alex tried to reason with himself, telling himself it was just an acoustic anomaly, some trick of the building's architecture. But the laughter, it wasn't natural. It was too sinister, too filled with malice. Sophie clung to him, too frightened to move. Neither of them could sleep, and the night dragged on in a tortured, sleepless haze. The baby's cries never stopped, and the laughter never ceased, blending into a nightmare that seemed endless. When Alex and Sophie knocked on the door of the neighboring apartment, they expected to be greeted by an agitated or exhausted mother, perhaps apologizing for the incessant cries of her child. What they didn't expect was the strange woman who opened the door with an eerie calmness. She was slightly hunched, her eyes sunken and tired, but there was no visible panic or urgency in her voice. Instead, she greeted them as though it were an ordinary, everyday situation. "The moment," woman said, her voice soft and hollow. "He cries like that sometimes, it's normal." Her words were so detached, so emotionless, that it sent a chill down Sophie's spine. A mother who was she spoke. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. "Oh, my baby." The accustomed to the sound of her baby crying might seem tired or frustrated, but this woman didn't seem to care at all. It was as if the cries had become background noise to her life. Something that didn't need attention, just acceptance. The couple exchanged looks, both trying to piece together what they were hearing and experiencing. The woman's behavior was unsettling. She made no attempt to explain why her baby was crying, nor did she show any signs of concern. Her face remained blank, and her demeanor didn't change in the slightest. When Sophie asked if everything was all right with the baby, the woman simply nodded slowly, confirming that it was nothing unusual. But even as she spoke, her eyes seemed distant, as if she were lost in thought or perhaps seeing something that wasn't there. It was as though she was trapped in a state of unfeeling, unable to connect with the reality of the situation. Sophie felt a growing unease, her thoughts swirling. Why was the woman so calm about a baby crying so loudly in the dead of night? Why didn't she seem more concerned? Before they could ask any more questions, the woman closed the door, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. It was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, one that looked more like a reflex than a genuine expression of comfort. It was as though she had heard this question countless times before, as though the situation was mundane to her. This response only added to the strangeness of the encounter. As Alex and Sophie walked back to their apartment, the silence between them was heavy. They had no answers, only more questions. The woman's behavior didn't sit right with them, and the odd sensation that something was amiss continued to linger. Neither of them could understand why the baby's cries seemed so loud, so incessant. And now, hearing the woman's response only added layers of mystery to the situation. Who was she? What was going on in that apartment? Sophie wondered aloud if the woman was just incredibly tired, or perhaps dealing with something more sinister that caused her to appear so detached. But when they returned to their apartment, the unsettling reality began to sink in. The cries resumed, and this time the laugh came with it, louder, more sinister, and closer. It echoed through the walls, reverberating in their ears, as though the source was coming from inside the room itself. Sophie clutched Alex's arm, her fear rising as the baby's cries mixed with the unnerving laughter. It was impossible to ignore. The sound seemed to permeate the very air around them, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of discomfort to a palpable sense of dread. The laughter wasn't normal. It wasn't a playful laugh. It was a deep, guttural laugh, one that seemed to mock their fear. The combination of the crying and the laughter left them feeling suffocated, as if they were no longer in control of their surroundings. Both of them knew they needed to leave, but a strange force kept them anchored to the room. Every time they tried to rationalize what was happening, the laughter grew louder, mocking them for their confusion, for their inability to understand. As the minutes stretched on, and the sound of the baby's cries mixed with the laughter, Alex and Sophie began to feel the true horror of the situation. It wasn't just that a baby was crying, it was the fact that the cries were so loud and unnatural. They were relentless, as though the baby would never stop, and worse yet, they were accompanied by an insane, maniacal laugh that seemed to come from nowhere. The laugh was disembodied, bouncing off the walls and filling every corner of the room, making it feel as though the very space around them was alive, pulsing with malicious energy. Sophie's heart raced as the laughter escalated, becoming more manic with each passing second. It felt as though it were seeping into her mind, twisting her thoughts, drawing out her deepest fears. The baby's cries became a constant drone, a relentless wail that threatened to tear at her sanity. The more she listened, the more the sound seemed to distort, the lines between what was real and what wasn't beginning to blur. Was the laughter real? Or was it just a product of the fear and paranoia settling into her mind? Alex, too, was starting to unravel. He tried to close his eyes, to block out the sounds, but it was impossible. It was as though the walls themselves were vibrating with the cries, the laughter swirling in the air like an oppressive force. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and despite the thick blankets on their bed, they were both shivering. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. It felt as though someone, was in the room with them, invisible, waiting for them to crack. They tried to talk, to reason with each other, but their words felt hollow in the face of the terror that surrounded them. Sophie wanted to scream, to demand that the sound stop, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if the room itself had swallowed their voices. The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, and with it, the laughter echoed back in cruel response. It was an endless cycle of fear and confusion that had no end. Alex tried to make sense of what was happening. He had heard of paranormal occurrences before, stories of haunted hotels and cursed locations, but he had never believed in them. Now, standing in the midst of the chaos, he found himself unable to deny what was happening. There was something in that apartment, something dark, something ancient that was feeding on their fear. As the night wore on, they both grew more desperate for the sound to stop, for the night to end. But the cries and the laughter didn't cease. They only grew more intense, until it felt as though the entire building was shaking with the force of the sounds. By the time dawn approached, Alex and Sophie were physically and emotionally drained. Neither of them had slept a single moment, both too terrified to close their eyes for fear of being trapped in a waking nightmare. The baby's cries continued unabated, now a constant, gnawing presence in their minds. The laughter had taken on an even more horrifying edge, as though mocking them for their inability to escape the torment. They sat huddled together in bed, trying to block out the sound, but it was impossible. The laughter, the cries, they had become part of the fabric of the apartment, as if they had always been there, waiting to be heard. Sophie could feel her sanity slipping away, the overwhelming terror twisting her thoughts. She didn't know how much longer she could endure the sounds, the feeling that something unseen was in the room with them, watching, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made her jump in fear. It was as if they were no longer alone in the apartment. There was something else, something dark, lurking in the shadows. Alex wasn't faring any better. He could feel his grip on reality beginning to loosen. The laughter seemed to be filling his mind, making him question his own perceptions. Was this real? Or was it all in his head? Every time he tried to focus, to push through the fear, the sound would overwhelm him again. It was impossible to escape. Sophie suggested they leave, but neither of them had the courage to face the hallway again, not with the horrifying sounds echoing all around them. They were trapped in a nightmare, and there seemed to be no way out. As they lay there, waiting for the sun to rise, they felt the weight of the apartment pressing down on them. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and every breath they took seemed to make the room colder. It was as though they were being slowly suffocated by the oppressive atmosphere. Neither of them knew what to do. All they could do was wait for the morning, hoping that somehow the nightmare would end with the break of dawn. By the time the first light of dawn began to break through the thick forest outside, Sophie and Alex were utterly exhausted. They had not slept a single minute, their bodies tense from fear, their minds overwhelmed with what they had experienced. The cries of the baby and the unnerving laughter had not stopped, but they were too fatigued to truly comprehend how the night had passed. Neither of them spoke as the sun's first rays illuminated the room. The silence that now enveloped them felt almost unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Sophie sat up in bed, rubbing her tired eyes. She glanced at Alex, who appeared just as drained as she was. They had both been too frightened to confront the reality of what had happened, too terrified to investigate further or leave the apartment during the night. But now, as the light filled the room, it felt as if they could finally breathe, even though a deep unease lingered within them. The couple got dressed in silence, trying to go through the motions of normality despite the palpable tension that hung in the air. They decided to visit the front desk to explain what had happened, hoping that someone there could offer an explanation. Maybe it was a technical issue, a problem with the building's acoustics, or even a misunderstanding about another guest. But deep down they knew that what they had experienced went far beyond something as simple as a technical glitch. The lobby was quiet when they arrived. The same elderly woman who had checked them in the previous day greeted them with the same warm, almost mechanical smile. They hesitated for a moment before Sophie spoke up, her voice shaky. "We stayed in apartment 14 last night, and we heard something. A baby crying the whole night. And laughing." She tried to sound as calm as possible, but her words betrayed her unease. The woman's expression shifted slightly. "Oh," she said, her voice distant. "No one has stayed in that room for years." She paused, her eyes glinting as she continued. That room has been vacant for a long time. We don't rent it out anymore." The couple's hearts skipped a beat. "What do you mean it's been vacant?" Alex asked, his voice rising slightly. "There was a woman there with a baby. We knocked on her door." The elderly woman's gaze hardened. She was now looking at them with an odd, unsettling calmness. "There's no one in that room," she repeated firmly. "No one has been there for a long time. The baby you heard, it wasn't real." Sophie felt her blood run cold. She wanted to question the woman further, but something in her eyes made her stop. She didn't need to hear more. She knew, deep in her gut, that the truth was far darker than they could understand. Shocked and confused by the woman's chilling revelation, Alex and Sophie left the front desk, both struggling to make sense of what had happened. The implication that no one had been staying in apartment 14, and yet they had encountered a woman with a baby, was too much for them to process. Their minds raced with the possibilities, but none of them made sense. The couple returned to their apartment, but it didn't feel like the same place. The room, which had felt so comfortable and relaxing just a day ago, now seemed oppressive. It felt colder, more unsettling, as though the walls were closing in on them. The silence that had greeted them when they arrived that morning seemed suffocating, as if the building itself were holding its breath. They decided to investigate the apartment again, hoping to uncover something that might explain what had happened. As they approached the door to apartment 14, they both felt a wave of dread wash over them. The hallway was empty, and no one was around to hear their conversation. Sophie reached for the doorknob, but as her fingers brushed it, she hesitated. Something in her gut told her not to enter, but Alex was already turning the handle. The door creaked open and they stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as it had been when they first arrived, modern, clean, and untouched by time. But as they moved further into the space, the overwhelming feeling of unease intensified. There was something about the room that didn't sit right with them. It felt wrong, as though it were a place that didn't belong to the world they knew. That they checked every corner of the room, hoping to find some kind of clue. Anything that might explain the woman they had encountered the night before. But there was no sign of anyone ever having stayed there. The bed was neatly made, the kitchen spotless, and the bathroom untouched. No personal items, no clothes, no baby toys, no signs of life. Nothing to indicate that a mother and child had been there just hours ago. The realization hit them like a slap to the face. There was no evidence, no trace of the woman or the baby. It was as if they had never been there at all. The eerie emptiness of the apartment filled them with dread. The couple was beginning to realize that they weren't dealing with an ordinary situation. They were in the midst of something far darker, something that defied logic and reason. Alex and Sophie's sense of disbelief turned into something far more unsettling as they continued to search for answers. They knew there had to be some explanation for what had happened, something tangible that they could point to and understand. But the more they tried to investigate, the more questions they uncovered. Questions that led them to a history of the resort that had been deliberately hidden from them. They started asking the staff about the history of the building, hoping to uncover something that could explain the strange occurrences. But the more they inquired, the more tight-lipped the staff became. It was as though they were deliberately avoiding the subject. Finally, they managed to track down an old, dusty guest book in a back office, a relic from years ago. Flipping through the pages, they found entries from decades past, but one entry stood out. It was dated many years before the couple's stay and was written in a shaky, almost desperate hand. The entry read, "The woman and her baby, they've gone. I think it was the curse that took them. The screams never stopped, not even when I left. I'm not sure if I'm the only one who's heard them, but they're here. They're always here." Sophie's hands trembled as she read the words aloud to Alex. His face drained of color as he listened. The chilling realization began to sink in. The cries, the laughter, the strange woman, they were all part of something much more sinister than they could have ever imagined. They had unknowingly stumbled into a place that was tied to a dark history, one that had been hidden from the public for years. What had happened to the woman and her baby? And why was their presence still haunting the apartment? It became clear that the couple wasn't just staying at a simple resort. They had unknowingly checked into a place that had been cursed, a place where the spirits of the past were trapped, unable to move on. The woman and her baby were just the latest chapter in a long, dark history of suffering and death that had haunted the building for generations. As the days passed, Alex and Sophie's experience began to take a more disturbing turn. What had started as a single night of terror in apartment 14 now seemed to be following them, haunting them even when they left the resort. They could no longer escape the unsettling feeling that the presence of the woman and her baby had become a part of their lives. At night, Sophie began to have vivid, terrifying dreams. She would wake up in the dark, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. In the dreams, she saw the woman and her baby, but they were no longer the same people she had encountered in the apartment. The woman's face was twisted in pain, her eyes hollow and lifeless, and the baby's cries were deafening. Sophie would reach out to help them, but her hands would pass right through them, as if they were nothing more than shadows. Alex had similar dreams, but his were even more disturbing. He would find himself walking through the empty resort, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But every time he opened a door, he would be faced with an empty, cold room, and the laughter would start again. It was the same laugh he had heard that first night, a laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the empty hallways. It wasn't just the dreams that tormented them. During the day, they began to hear whispers, faint and distant, but always there. The cries of the baby echoed in the back of their minds, even when they were miles away from the resort. It was as if the curse had followed them, a constant reminder of the terror they had experienced. No matter where they went, the presence of the woman and her baby seemed to linger, a constant, oppressive weight that they couldn't escape. Realizing that they were no longer safe from whatever dark force had taken hold of the resort, Alex and Sophie knew they had to confront it directly. They returned to the apartment one last time, determined to end the nightmare once and for all. But when they entered the room, they found it different. The air was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to pulse with an energy they could almost touch. They began searching the apartment for any clue that could explain the presence of the woman and her baby. What they discovered was horrifying, a hidden door behind the large mirror in the bedroom. It opened into a small, forgotten room that seemed to be untouched by time. The room was filled with old, decaying objects, clothes, toys, and remnants of a life long gone. As they stepped further into the room, the cries of the baby filled the air once again, but this time it was accompanied by a shadow, a dark, swirling form that hovered near the door. The woman appeared before them, her face now a mask of anguish and despair. She whispered, "You shouldn't have come. You should have left when you had the chance." And just like that, they understood. The curse wasn't just on the room, it was on the very land. It was too late to leave, too late to escape. The spirits of the past had claimed them, and they would never be free.